So today I'm going to talk about some work we've done on syntactic priming with L2 language learners. And I'm going to start with the acknowledgements because these things always get rushed at the end. So just to say, this is research that was funded by a Leverhulme Trust grant. Or most of what I'm going to present is from that grant, which funded Marion to do her PhD with me and Emma Ushioda. So a lot of what I'm presenting, or in fact, all the studies I'm presenting are things that Marion designed and conducted. So all the credit goes to Marion for this, and any mistakes are my own. And also just to acknowledge a couple of collaborators who we did a couple of side studies with, I'm going to talk about as well, who weren't part of the Leverhulme project. And then also Sophie Hardy was a postdoc working on this grant. I'm not going to have time to talk about her work today, but she had lots of involvement across the whole grant, and certainly things like the graphs and things are courtesy of her excellent R skills. So thanks to her, and thanks to all the volunteer RAs who helped us do these studies, and the many, many L2 learners at Warwick, and actually we ended up recruiting from around the world for some of these. So thanks to all of those. So, as Patrick said, I have come full circle. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of my background to set this in context, and also to give myself a little bit of a chance to give a disclaimer. So I did come to Lancaster a long time ago. This is me 20 years ago, graduating, back when the university's logo was a little bit different. And I started out as a French and studies student. I was actually living in this building here, which is nice to be back in, and studying linguistics and French. So I myself was an L2 learner. So my definition of L2 here is a late learner of a second language. So not somebody who's growing up sequentially or simultaneously bilingual, but someone who's acquiring a language through sort of more educational, pedagogical sort of context. So that was me at university, acquiring French and studying linguistics alongside. And it was really the linguistics that captured my interest. And as Patrick said, I went off to Edinburgh to study developmental linguistics, fully intending to do a PhD on L2 learning and ultimate attainment and all sorts. I got a little bit seduced by the L1 stuff at that time, though, and I ended up doing my PhD with children and a postdoc studying child development. But in the back of my head, there was all this little itch about L2 learning that I wanted to scratch. And so this grant that I'm going to talk about today was my first attempt to come back to that sort of area of working. So coming back to questions about L2 language development. So the disclaimer is, if I get loads of stuff wrong, just bear with me, because I've spent a lot of time working with kids, and this is my first foray back into the field of second language acquisition. Across all of that, the kind of things that I've been interested in are the kind of representations we acquire when we're using language and when we're learning language. And my focus is on syntax, so how we put words together. And how do we learn these things as well? And as we said, a lot of that research has been on mostly monolingual children, but we've been doing some recent work with bilingual children. And more recently in this project with L2, so late adult language learners. And that's the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the syntactic priming stuff. I thought it was probably a new sort of paradigm for people here. I don't think people are generally using syntactic priming here. So I thought I would sort of give an overview of what we've done and the kind of questions it's addressing and the kind of things that we're finding in it. So it is going to be a bit of a rush, I imagine. I've probably put too much in, but I'm just going to try and cover the various different things we've done. But I'll start by trying to give an overview of what priming is, what it looks like in L2 speakers, and then the kind of studies we've done. Okie dokie. If I'm going too fast, do just wave. Tell me to slow down. All right, so syntactic priming. The idea is it's this phenomenon whereby across speakers or within speakers, we might repeat the syntactic structure of an utterance that we've just experienced. And this is done unconsciously, so people are generally unaware of the kind of syntax that they're using. It happens across lexical content, so it's not about repeating the words in a given structure, it's about repeating that sort of phrase structure that underlines those sentences. And it can occur between speakers as well as within speakers and between utterances. So it's this kind of epiphenomenon. You can observe it in corpuses of natural language speech, and it's been used a lot as an experimental manipulation to look at the kind of ways in which people use language. So just to illustrate, if you were asked to describe this kind of picture, you could use a passive, like the Queen got chased by a dog, to describe it. And you would be more likely to do so if you just heard a passive in the previous sort of discourse. So if somebody had just said the pet show was organised by the royal household, you might be more likely to say the Queen got chased by a dog. And that repetition of the passive structure across those utterances is syntactic priming. That's all it is. And as you can see, it doesn't rely on repeated words. It's that repeated constituent or phrase structure. Kay Bock was like the first person to really use this as an experimental paradigm. So she did a lot of the really early work demonstrating how syntactic priming occurs, the sort of circumstances where you do and don't see priming. And so this is the sort of first illustration of the effect. Speakers were asked to read sentences and describe pictures, and they were asked to do this in the context of a memory task. So they're focusing on, have they seen the sentence or the picture before? They're not asked to think about the kind of language they're using. And what she found is if they'd heard or read an active sentence, they were more likely to describe the picture with an active description. And if they heard or read a passive sentence, they were more likely to use a passive themselves. And you get the parallel findings for these different types of datives. Across many other studies, people have sort of ruled out alternative explanations for this. So it's not the case that syntactic priming effects are reliant on repeating close class items. So things like a dative with a for preposition will prime a dative with a to preposition. We don't have to repeat those items for the effect to occur. It doesn't require, or it doesn't occur when the sentences look very similar but actually have different structures. So it is something to do with the structures. And it doesn't just occur between production and production, it occurs between comprehension and production, comprehension and comprehension. So it's not related to those mechanisms of language processing. It appears to be related to some kind of underlying representation of syntactic structure. So the idea is that when you experience a prime, whether that's reading or saying it, you're activating some kind of mental representation for that sentence. And that activation makes that structural representation more available for use subsequently. So the first sort of implication is that evidence of these kind of effects suggests that speakers have acquired syntactic representations. If we can get priming to occur, we can assume, assuming there's no other explanations, that those speakers have acquired those kind of representations. So it's really useful in the learning literature if you want to look at, for example, children, at what stage have they acquired these kind of abstract representations. And similarly, it can be applied to L2 speakers as well. But other research shows that it's not just a sort of transient effect. It's not just the case that processing one sentence leads to an immediate effect on your subsequent use of language. These kind of effects actually persist over several intervening sentences, or across from one task to another, or even across sessions separated by a week or a day. So the idea is that this kind of experience of processing particular structures has some kind of lasting effect on those representations beyond just that immediate activation. We also know that these effects can be accumulative, so the more you experience a particular structure, the more likely you are to use it again. So you get this kind of, again, it's not just like a transient effect, it builds up. And so this has been taken as evidence that this kind of persistent priming indicates implicit learning. And I put that in whatever you call these things, because I know we have to be really careful saying implicit learning in other contexts. People who do syntactic priming studies bandy implicit learning around, but they actually have a very specific and narrow meaning of implicit learning, which when you take it into other contexts, people don't appreciate or understand. So like I say, it's a very narrow definition of implicit learning. So it's the idea that this kind of reuse of structures is automatic. People don't do it consciously, so it's implicit in that sense. And it has a persistent effect, so maybe across a few sentences or across a task or into another session, which is sort of viewed as learning, but it's learning in the sense of maybe adapting your representations, tuning them to what you've heard, making one thing more likely than another. It's not necessarily learning from the start or learning something new, perhaps. So like I say, I use it in inverted quotes. It's more like a kind of adaptation sort of effect. So that's the kind of very quick overview of syntactic priming and what it implies. Just to very briefly also look at how that applies in the L2 literature. So just as with studies with L1 speaking adults or monolingual speaking adults, there's been quite a lot of research with L2 speakers. Most of it is a lot more recent. But this shows that just like speakers speaking their L1, speakers using their L2 are susceptible to priming. So this kind of immediate repetition of structures. And this can manifest either as helping them to produce a structure they would normally use, so something that's quite dispreferred, less frequent, more complex, or using that structure more accurately, so producing a more accurate form of an L2 structure. And just like with L1 speakers, these effects can persist as well. So it's not the case that it's just a transient effect for L2 speakers, but it can be lasting as well. In a recent sort of review of the field of L2 syntactic priming, Jackson makes a number of suggestions for things that can be explored still. So, for example, the extent to which the mechanisms of priming are implicit or explicit is something that is still important to understand, especially in the context of L2 learning. So there's models of syntactic priming that apply to L1 speakers look at whether or not these kind of adaptation mechanisms are implicit, whether any of the effects involve some sort of more explicit processes. But I think this becomes even more interesting when we think about L2 learners and how they might be using language, the kind of the different sort of contexts and factors that might affect the way they choose to use language as well. And the stage at which learners might benefit from this kind of input is probably something worth defining, because you maybe need a little bit of knowledge about language before these things are useful to you. But, you know, these studies can be used to sort of work out what kind of input is useful at what stages for learners. We see a lot of variation in priming effects between individuals. So understanding the kind of factors that drive that would be really useful for understanding how this might be beneficial to L2 speakers. And the context of interaction. So a lot of these things are either done in a classroom or in a lab. So understanding the effects of those different things is useful. The project we did ended up mostly focusing on the two that I've highlighted there. We did actually intend to do, and we did try to do some work collecting information about individual differences. And I think we learned a lot about how not to do individual differences studies in doing that. So I'm not going to talk about that today. We ended up with some quite mixed results there, and that's something we're still trying to figure out. But yes, what we're going to look at today mostly sort of addresses these questions a little bit. Okay, so before I go on to the studies, I'm just going to briefly explain the sort of general method that we use in all of these, or I think in nearly all of these studies. So we always do some kind of turn-taking task, so that there's some kind of interaction between a learner and some input. So they're experiencing these primes, whether that's hearing another person produce something or reading something that's written on the screen. And then they're describing another picture or using some words to create a sentence immediately afterwards. So there's this kind of prime target trial structure. And this allows us to look at immediate priming effects. So when do they reuse the structure of the prime in their target response, and how frequent do they use it in different contexts? So that's that kind of immediate priming effect. Do they just show these immediate repetition? And then we've also wanted to look at these kind of persistent effects. And to do this, we ask, in most of the studies, I think we can include like a pre and a post test, where we ask people to describe the pictures or create these sentences, but they haven't experienced a prime in that context. So they're just giving us this kind of their use of the structures without any priming. And so beforehand, that gives us like a sense of their baseline production. How likely are they to use these structures before they experience the priming? And then in a sort of post-test after the priming phase, it allows us to look at, does that effect of the priming persist? Does it carry on even when we stop giving them the primes? So that's the kind of the implicit learning part that that's measuring. All right. Yeah, so hopefully all of the studies include something like this. So it should, even though there's differences amongst the studies, there's this kind of overarching structure across all of them. Okay, so I'm going to start with the study, which is the first study that Marion did as part of her PhD. We haven't actually published this yet because it's proving a little bit tricky. We probably threw a little bit too much into it. And yeah, there's a lot to pull apart, which has made it a bit of a mammoth job. So what I'm going to present isn't published results, so don't quote me on any of these. But it's the study that's most like the kind of typical priming study you would see in the psycholinguistic literature. So I thought it's a good place to start. And everything else sort of goes off in different directions after this. So this is kind of a bog standard priming study, basically. And it was pre-pandemic as well, so we even did this one in person. So we looked at syntactic priming in a face-to-face interaction with an experimenter. And we looked at, as I explained in that method, the kind of immediate syntactic priming effects. Do they persist into some kind of post-test? And then the thing that we manipulated two things. One was the structures that we used. So we had priming of two structures to look at whether or not the frequency or the complexity of that structure or the degree which it overlaps with the L2 was important. And then we looked at the lexical overlap. So was there a repeated verb between the prime and target? Because in L1 speakers, this usually boosts priming effects. It makes it much more likely that priming will occur. And as I said, we did look at individual differences, but I'm not going to talk about those today. So we'll just ignore that and move on. So in this study, we tested L2 learners of French. So they were university students at Warwick studying for a French degree. So they all had English as their L1. We did a picture finding task with the experimenter. So this diagram basically illustrates what's going on. Speakers have a bunch of pictures in front of them. The experimenter describes one, and in doing so is providing the syntactic prime for the participant, and the participant has to find that picture from the array. So it's this task is sort of embedded in this kind of picture finding task. And then it's the participant's turn to describe a picture for the experimenter to find. So you just keep going in this kind of alternating describing and finding type task. And so we targeted two structures. So passives, which have the same form in English and French and are sort of pretty much dispreferred in both languages. And then we looked at these temporal adverbial phrases, so things like in the summer I go swimming, or I go swimming in the summer, and whether or not they're fronted, so put at the front of the sentence or at the end. And I think in French speakers they prefer it to be fronted, and English prefer it the other way around. It was a long time ago, and if I've got that wrong, I'm sorry. But there's a difference in English to French preferences for these. And between participants, we manipulated whether the primes always have the same verbs as the target or different ones. Okay, so this gives you a sense of what those kind of pictures look like. So there's, for the fronted sentences, there's a kind of an event going on, which we're not super interested in. And there's a temporal sort of indicator, so at midday, in the summer, or at 7 p.m. And the experimenter used primes where they either fronted it, so at midi, or they put it at the end. And between participants, like I say, they had either the same temporal phrase or a different one. So here in the participant's target picture, this one's got en été, which overlaps with this one, but not with this one. We put the words on the pictures so that participants didn't have to retrieve all the lexical items. So that didn't sort of interfere with what they were trying to say. They've got that and they can just put the words together. And then so the same thing for the active passives. You've got an event. It can either be described with an active, the cowboy's pushing the swimmer, or a passive, this one's being pushed by the cowboy. And we manipulated whether or not it had the same verb as the target. And again, we provided all the lexical items so that they didn't have to retrieve those. Okay, so they take turns, the experimenter describes a picture, the participant finds it in the array, and then the participant describes a picture and the experimenter finds it. And what we're interested in is, how do they describe this picture, and is it related to the way in which the experimenter described theirs? So in these graphs, they're all going to look the same across all the studies. So we're always going to be plotting the proportion of the target responses. So here, either the fronted ones or the passive ones, and the proportion they produce in the condition where the prime was non-fronted or where it was fronted, or whether it was active or passive. And here we've separated out the condition where there was overlap and no overlap. So what we see here for those fronted sentences, so the bars represent the proportions, and then over that we've put the individual performance. So each dot represents the individual's mean proportion of fronted sentences in that condition, or in both conditions, and the line connects up the individuals. So this individual produced about 50% in the non-fronted and about, 60-something% in the fronted condition. So those lines essentially represent individual priming effects, so how much they increased across conditions, which helps to give a sense of, despite the means, what's going on in these different conditions. So what we see, the difference between these bars is basically your priming effect, or the difference in these slopes. And these are the passives as well. So exactly the same thing being plotted, but here we're looking at passives after passive and active primes. And what we found is there's overall a main effect of priming. So participants produce more of the target structure after the prime than after the alternative. And we found a main effect of structure, so they tend to produce more of these kind of fronted responses than passives. So passives really are dispreferred. But there was no interaction, so the priming effect didn't really vary depending on those structures. So yeah, there was no real difference in the priming effect there. When we look at the condition with overlap, we get what we call a lexical boost. So that priming effect is stronger when there's the repeated verb or the repeated temporal phrase. So basically this gap is bigger than this gap. And that also, there was an interaction with structure. So the lexical boost here for passives is bigger than the lexical boost for those fronted ones. So probably because passives are so dispreferred, that's a real boost when you can reuse the verb. And you can see with the lines that in that lexical overlap condition, they are all going very much upwards, whereas in the no overlap condition, they tend to be a lot more variable. So when you can repeat some of the lexical content, speakers are much more likely to do so, basically. Okay, so that was the immediate priming. When we look at the long-term effects, the persistence, what we see is, again, a difference between conditions. So here we're plotting the proportion of responses in the pre-test and the post-tests. And across the structures, we find that compared to the pre-test, speakers are using these structures more in the post-test. And there was a difference, again, with the structure. So that effect is bigger for the passives. So the persistence is bigger for the passive sentences than for the fronted. We also find quite a large effect in the overlap condition, which isn't what we'd really expect, given theories about syntactic priming. So the idea is that if you're repeating the words, you might well be using some kind of explicit memory of that form to reuse it, and that would be more likely to decay quicker. So you wouldn't expect the persistence to occur in the condition with overlap, or not to occur to a greater extent. So that seems to suggest something interesting about the way in which L2 speakers are making use of this kind of priming input. Okay, so just to quickly sum up, in face-to-face interactions, we found that L2 speakers or L2 learners of French were primed in sort of immediately and in a post-test relative to a pre-test, so having a persistent effect, and there was a greater effect when there was lexical overlap. So these are kind of just exactly the kind of effects we'd expect to see. But we also found that those effects were bigger for passives than for the fronted adverbials. And this is kind of where we're up to with the study. It's why it's not actually submitted yet. It's because we're trying to figure out what's going on here. Is this some kind of inverse preference because those passives are less frequent or more dispreferred, that prime has a bigger effect for participants? Or could it be some kind of transfer for L1 that is boosting it because it's the passive and the in French and English are very, very similar, does that help them to produce this structure more in French than, for example, the fronted adverbials? So I don't know, we'll come back to that at some point, but that just gives you a sense of what these kind of studies look like. In the rest of the studies, we kind of moved on to explore different questions about the mechanisms of priming and priming in L2 speakers. And all of these are now online studies because we're hitting the pandemic at this point, and so everything went online. So this isn't necessarily the direction we were planning to go in for this this project, but it allowed us to try some different things. So it worked out in the end. So study 2 is an online task. It's actually very, very similar to the first one. So we're looking at immediate effects of priming and the persistent effects of priming, so an immediate post-test, but we decided to extend this to a second post-test that participants completed a week later. So we know that if they've experienced some priming, they carry on using those structures immediately, but what happens if they're given a similar task about a week later? Does that effect persist, or is it worn off completely? And by presenting this online, it allowed us to manipulate the effects of modality. So we looked at, we compared learners who listened to the primes versus learners who read the primes. And we thought this might be interesting because, maybe reading would be easier for L2 speakers than listening. So maybe, it would be interesting questions about whether one modality or another better supported this kind of priming or learning effect. So we had about 120 L2 learners of English this time who had French as their L1. And they completed a picture description task online. So half of them read the primes and half of them listened to the primes. And they saw, well, I'll show you in a second, they saw the pictures and then they described some others. And we used the same pre-test, post-test around a priming phase structure, but added in this second post-test. We managed to get 100 people to come back and do that a week later, which we're quite pleased with, but it's not quite as many as started the task. And this time we just looked at that one structure, the passive. So this was presented in Qualtrics, and participants, like I say, saw a picture on the screen, and those in the listening condition heard a sentence describing it. So, for example, the jester is being kicked by the waitress, or those in the reading condition could see the sentence on the screen, they read it, and they were asked to decide if the description matched the image, and this was just like an attention check to make sure they were paying attention, listening to the primes, looking at the pictures. Occasionally they had items that didn't match just to keep them paying attention. And then they were presented with another picture and asked to describe it, to type out a description of it. And again, we gave them the words on the screen so they didn't have to come up with the words themselves. Okay, so in that immediate priming phrase, when they're alternating between listening, reading, and writing, what we see, these are plotted exactly the same as the previous graphs. We see this priming effect, whereby they use more passive targets after passive primes than after active primes. And that effect was actually slightly larger for those in the listening condition than the reading. So we get a significant interaction between priming and modality. So stronger priming when listening to the sentences than when reading. Moving on to the post-tests. So this was immediately after that priming phase, they described another block of pictures without any primes. And again, we see a persistent effect. So compared to the pre-test where they barely used any passives, they use a lot more in that post-test. And then in the post-test a week later, we find quite a strong effect still of that priming. So 1 week later, they do the exact same thing again. They describe a bunch of pictures, and they're still more likely to use passives in that post-test than in the pre-test. And in fact, it hasn't come down from the immediate post-test. There's no effects of modality in either of these. So at this point, whether you've heard or read the primes doesn't make any difference. So what we have here is quite a nice demonstration that this kind of task works in an online task. There's no interlocutor, you're not interacting with another person, but you might be listening or reading some structures on screen and then writing some descriptions. And that has an immediate priming effect and both a sort of immediate and 1 week delayed effect as well. we did find more immediate priming in the listening condition, and we wonder if this may be consistent with findings of better learning from auditory input. But this didn't actually have a lasting effect. So another alternative explanation could be, again, this kind of inverse preference or surprisal effect where maybe you don't expect to hear passives. People tend to use them in written text, but not so much in spoken text. So maybe that's a bit surprising. It's more like to have a priming effect if it's more surprising. So yeah, we're not entirely sure. We are following this one up with another study where we're fully crossing speaking and reading and listening and writing to see if we can replicate that finding and find out a little bit more about it. Okay. This next study is another one that was presented online, but it goes back to the question of explicit memory and priming, which I think I actually glossed over really, really quickly at the beginning. But the idea is we assume these primary effects are implicit and unconscious, but it has been argued that when there is some kind of lexical overlap between primes and targets, speakers might rely on an explicit memory for that structure, and that might boost, as well as the activation of the representation, and that might boost the priming effect. And we do see that repetition of words increases the priming, but it's a very short-lived effect as well. So once you start to add some sentences in between, that priming, that boost to priming disappears. So that sort of supports the idea that maybe speakers are holding some of that information in short-term memory and reusing it when they can. So we used this idea, and this was the study we did with Meryl and Rob as well, so credit to them for this. This was Meryl and Marion's idea, was to look at, is it the case that if speakers can use those kind of that explicit memory for structures, are they more likely to do so? And are they more likely to do so earlier on in sort of language learning? So lower proficiency L2 speakers, do they make more use of these kind of explicit memories of structures because they don't have maybe the syntactic knowledge, the abstract knowledge, or those representations to rely on? And this ties into Hartzucker and Bernoulli's developmental model of sort of L2 learning, where they propose that speakers start out without any sort of L2 knowledge, so they use maybe their L1 knowledge or these kind of explicit knowledge of what they've heard when they're speaking in their L2. So to test this, Meryl and Marion came up with the idea of using a dual task, where alongside the priming task, you ask people to do a working memory task. And so this taxes their ability to hold the prime in memory and should therefore change what priming occurs if speakers are using that kind of explicit memory. So we manipulated whether or not they were doing a low working memory task or a high working memory task and looked at the extent to which that changed the priming effect. And then we also looked at whether that effect varied depending on the proficiency of learners as well. Okay. So again, they used L2 learners of French with L1 English, and they were able to collect data from 100 participants classified as lower proficiency and 100 classified as high. As I say, they used this kind of dual picture description memory task, which I'll illustrate on the next slide. And we just looked at passives, and in all of these conditions, we had the lexical overlap. So the condition where we'd expect them to be using explicit memory. So what happened is they were presented with a prime, so a picture of an event and a sentence describing it, so either an active or passive, and again asked to confirm whether or not it matched as a kind of keeping people paying attention. Then they were given the sort of memory task, which was a digit span task. So they were asked to look at a series of letters, memorize it, and then write it down. And then they described the target picture in a box. And so what we varied was how long the letter span task was. So in the low condition, it was just 2 letters they had to memorize. And in the high condition, it was based on their performance on like the digit span task before they started. So we asked them to do a digit span task and sort of base their high load on what was a high memory load for them. Okay, So I'm presenting exactly the same kind of graph again, but what we've got here on the right is low proficiency participants, and on the left you've got your high proficiency participants, and we're splitting whether or not they were describing pictures under the high working memory load or the low working memory load, and that load was manipulated within participants, so they had different trials with high or low load. And again, we're plotting the proportion of passives after passive primes and active primes. So you can see that across conditions, there's a priming effect. They produce more passives after passive primes than after active primes. But what we found was there was an interaction with load as well. So this priming effect, this difference between these bars, is bigger in the low load condition than in the high load condition. There's no three-way interaction with proficiency though, so being low or high proficiency in French didn't make a difference. Based on there was the interaction approach significance. So based on this, Meryl and Marion conducted some exploratory analyses to try and look at whether proficiency measured continuously gave us a sort of a better understanding of these effects. So here we've split the group into two groups, but what we did, we put all the data back together again and looked at proficiency scores as a continuous measure and whether that changed the likelihood of there being an effect in the low or the high proficiency. And it did, but not in the way we expected. So what we found was a three-way interaction between proficiency, load, and priming. But where in the low condition, you can see that orange line is basically flat. So as proficiency increases, there's no change, no real overall change in priming in the low load. So in the low load condition, there's basically no interaction between proficiency and priming. It doesn't change what's going on. In the high load condition, we find that as proficiency increases, the priming actually goes down, which is not what we expected. I think it's the opposite of what we expected. So we'd expect that as proficiency increases, the priming would go up essentially, because the lower proficiency participants wouldn't be able to rely on their explicit memory, but the higher proficiency participants should have that knowledge of language structures that they can rely on. But we found the opposite. Okay. So what we infer from this is that those group differences might indicate different strategies for different types of speakers. So the low proficiency learners who show more priming in the high load condition are maybe just trying to hold on to that prime sentence regardless of the load condition. So they try to copy the prime sentence throughout, irrespective of whether that memory task was a high or a low load. And there was some evidence for this in the post-experiment questionnaires. We asked them if they'd used any strategies, and some participants, and more low proficiency participants, did say they tried to copy the sentences or tried to remember the sentences. And we thought maybe the priming goes down in the high proficiency learners because once they're taxed by that working memory task, they sort of abandon trying to remember the prime sentence and use their own sort of knowledge of language to describe those targets. But because they haven't got that lexical boost effect, the priming effect becomes smaller. So yeah, it might sound like we're trying to have our cake and eat it there, but that's the best way we can describe those effects that we found. Irrespective of proficiency, we found that priming with lexical overlap does appear to at least partially rely on explicit memory. So both the high and the low proficiency participants showed really stronger priming in that low load condition where they could rely on explicit memory. All right, how are we doing for time? What's the time? 10:02. So I might skip on to the last study, because the study 4 with written chat, I will just show you. I won't talk through the details. Essentially, we used a written chat study where we asked people to describe pictures with an experimenter using the chat function in Teams. And yeah, this was quite a nice study. Marion was interested in the idea of conscious decisions. So going a bit further with this idea of explicit memories, Do participants make conscious decisions to use different structures based on, the complexity of it, their knowledge, their motivation for learning? Are they trying to repeat what the native speaker experimenter is saying? And she thought the chat environment would be a really nice way of doing this because they have those sentences written on the screen in front of them. We also used it as a way of manipulating more than one structure at a time. And what we ended up with is significant priming, but it's really, really tiny. So you can see the difference between those bars is quite small. And across the different structures that we looked at, again, you get these quite small priming effects, but they are significant. And they have a lasting effect. So from a pre-test to a post-test, we do see an increase. And that's the same across the different structures. So I rushed through that one, but I think we're short on time. But basically, in this kind of written chat environment, when you use 3 structures, you still get these L2 priming effects, and they persist to a post-test. We didn't really find an interaction between so we asked participants, did you consciously decide to use this structure in the experiment? We looked at those who said yes, no idea, and no, and we didn't find any sort of interaction between those conscious decisions and the sort of alignment that we observed. So this suggests that maybe priming does rely on these kind of implicit processes, but we do have to be a bit careful because once we start breaking those groups down into yes, no, and other, we're making quite small groups. And like I say, the priming effects were small. So there was overall effect of speakers who said they did make a conscious decision to use those structures, did produce more of them, even though it wasn't necessarily a priming effect. So there may be some evidence there that speakers can, based on their sort of prior knowledge of the structures or their motivations for language learning, can make decisions to use structures in these kind of tasks as well. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the last study, which is one we've just submitted. And this was a study that Marion proposed to the EuroSLA committee and received a small bursary from them to run. So it's a really nice study, and thank you very much to them for helping her with that. And she wanted to look at whether sort of extramural English through things like watching TV, watching YouTube videos is also a source of learning. And we know that lots of people use these kind of screen media, and it must be a source of learning, but can we tap into what's happening in those kind of environments? Can we find that watching some kind of audio-visual content can prime speakers to use structures more accurately? And she threw in a manipulation where we looked at adding captions to the screen, so subtitles, and also instructions to see if this influenced priming or not. So again, thinking about in what context does priming occur, but also which aspects of priming might be implicit or susceptible to more external influences as well. So this time we used learners of English who had French as their first language. And we asked them to formulate questions, so WH questions with do support, which tends to be quite difficult for L2 learners of English. And so we looked at how accurate they were at doing this before and after watching a YouTube video which contained loads of WH questions. And between participants, we manipulated whether they got no captions on the screen, captions, or captions and instructions about the grammatical structure as well. And again, we had an immediate post-test for this one and a delayed post-test a week later. So Breaking English very kindly allowed Marion to use their video. So it's not completely natural input. These are videos that people make to kind of illustrate different aspects of grammar for L2 learners. So here there's 2 people having a relatively natural conversation about virtual reality, but they deliberately insert lots and lots of WH questions about it. So learners watch these videos, and some of them had captions on the screens and some of them didn't. And some of them received instructions beforehand about the grammatical form that they were going to be shown. So they were told you're going to watch a video in English on virtual reality. And you're going to hear and read some questions which have the following grammatical form. So a question word, do auxiliary, subject and verb. So they're given the information about explicit instructions about that grammatical form before they watch the videos. And then to measure whether there's any kind of priming, we asked people to formulate questions. So this is not a picture description task, but they were given a set of words. They were given the answer to the question, and they were asked to put these words into a question. So here it would be, how long do giraffes live is the correct answer. And we look at how well or how accurately they can formulate questions before watching the video, immediately afterwards, and then in a post-test a week later. We did, I think we did do a little bit of screening on this, and we did exclude people who were already really quite accurate at questions. So we did try to target learners who weren't very good at this. So this graph will look a little bit different to the last one. So this is just a pre-test, post-test comparison. So we're looking at the proportion of accurate questions. So not one structure after a target structure or not, but what frequency of questions were accurately produced in the pre-test, the immediate post-test, and the delayed test for the people with no captions, captions, or instructions. And I hate this graph because it looks like it's got measles. It makes my skin crawl a little bit. But those dots are individuals, so you can see the range of performances between individuals as well as the mean productions. So what we found here was a main effective section for all participants. So after watching the video, participants produced more accurate WH questions in the post-test than in the pre-tests. We also found a main effect of captions. So looking at those who had captions versus those who didn't, there were more accurate WH questions in the captions conditions. We didn't find overall any long-term effects or any effects of instructions. Which is maybe a bit surprising. If you look at the graph, it does look like there's at least some effect of instructions or some kind of learning in some of the conditions. So we did carry out some exploratory analyses. First of all, just looking at the people who completed the immediate test, because we did lose some participants for the post-test. So if we increase the number of participants in our sample by just looking at those who did the first two bits, can we find any effect of the captions and interactions there? What we found was, again, the effective test phase was significant, and the difference between captions and no captions was significant, but again, no interaction with instructions. Trying to read my notes that I've written here. What have I said? Test phase by captions interaction. So overall, there was no priming in the no captions condition, but in the captions conditions there was, essentially. When we look at the analyses with proficiency included, we do see an effect of instructions. So when we take into account participants' proficiency, we do see that those in the instructions condition did produce more WH questions than those without instructions. But that's when we include proficiency as well. So that's why we get these sort of differences in the graphs, but it's related to proficiency. So I think it's participants with lower proficiency produce more WH questions when they have instructions than when they don't, compared to those with higher proficiency. Okay, so just to wrap up, again, we see these reliable priming effects in this different context. We also find that the captions are important. And we think this maybe helps learners process or comprehend the audiovisual input. And instructions did show an effect depending on proficiency, but we didn't get any long-term priming effects from this study. And that may be because it was a very short video. I think there's only about 10 or so WH questions in that video. It may be not enough to actually promote a lasting effect. So in contrast to the other studies, we didn't see that long-term priming effect. Okay, right, let's wrap up because it's nearly 1 o'clock. So we've sort of talked about the findings from each of the studies. So these are just very, very general conclusions. So we see that syntactic priming supports production. It helps LT speakers produce these dispreferred structures, and it leads to a persistent effect most of the time. So it increases their production of those structures in an immediate post-test, but also in post-tests a week later. And we observed these effects across a multitude of structures, languages, and contexts. So it's quite a robust effect. We know syntactic priming is robust. We see it in speakers all the time, but in this sort of L2 context, we've found it across a variety of different environments. I didn't talk much about the chat study, but most of the studies target one structure, and then we find quite large priming effects. But when we started to mix different structures in and speakers had to switch between different types of sentences, we found those effects quite attenuated. So focusing on one structure at a time is maybe quite useful. This is quite a wild gloss, but largely our effects seem to be implicit. So speakers are generally not conscious of the manipulations. We see these lasting effects, which we don't think are related to people remembering the task. But different factors of the results at least support a multifactorial account of priming, whereby in certain contexts, for example, with lexical overlap, explicit processes might contribute to that priming effect. And in terms of sort of L2, learners sort of more conscious or motivations for using structures, there's some evidence for that in some other studies as well. Most of our studies did use speakers with a reasonable degree of proficiency. So I didn't report it on all of them, but most of them were at least medium proficiency based on self-report or something like the Lextail. So it leaves open a question of how useful these tasks might be for lower proficiency speakers. We did see in the study where we specifically target low proficiency speakers that the priming effects are quite strong when they have lexical overlap. So across these different studies, there's theoretical implications when we think about what syntactic priming tells us about language learning and processing, the kind of mechanisms that might underlie that, and the way in which different factors might interact with that. But one of the things Mariam was particularly keen on was the pedagogical implications of these findings. So the way in which these kind of activities could actually translate to sort of teaching environments and provide ways to help speakers produce structures that they maybe wouldn't use normally. And these activities tend to have lasting effects, so could be quite a useful activity in the classroom. And that was certainly something we tried to do, but our school-based study literally started about 2 weeks before the pandemic, so really we didn't get to run that one. But certainly these kind of, across these different kind of contexts and things, it looks like these kind of activities can be really useful in the classroom. So thank you very much for listening. And does anyone have any questions? I probably need to turn my